Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am Professor and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. Philip Quaque is celebrated in Ghana as a pioneer in education, having been responsible for setting up the school at Philip Castle in 1776. In reality, his was not the first European school, for in 1722, the Danes had established a school for the mulato or mixed-race children of European company officials at Christiansborg Castle at Osu. And in the process of evangelizing among the native population, the Portuguese had also attempted many educational experiments since the building of Elmina Castle in 1482. First for the children of royals, and then incorporating those of influential traders and other personages. Philip Quaque was born in 1741 in Cape Coast, then in the Gold Coast colony, now Ghana, to Birempong Cudjoe, a prominent caboceer in the town. He became a chaplain at the Cape Coast Castle after returning from England with a theology degree from Oxford. This episode will be taking a look at the life and times of Philip Quaque, especially with what might be described as his extraordinary loneliness as a pioneer Anglican chaplain among a sea of both European and African skeptics. As I mentioned a moment ago, Quaque was born to Birempong Cudjoe, who was a prominent merchant in the town. The term caboceer was used to refer to the local mercantile class, some of whom worked as trade agents for the European establishments and even drew salaries from them. Some caboceers grew to be extremely powerful and influential, and were even known to cultivate their own militias to protect their goods and hinterland trade routes, and sometimes even to foment trouble for the Europeans in the forts and castle. The name Birempong is a title that translates from the Akan as big man or man of substance, and suggests that Quaque's father was very important in the community. Philip himself was named Quaque at birth, which, according to the Akan naming system that obtains to this day, meant that he was a male born on Wednesday. At the age of 10, Philip Quaque was sent as one of 3 Fanti boys by the Reverend Thomas Thompson of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the SPG, to England for their education. One of the boys died early in their stay. The second suffered a mental breakdown. It was only Quaque who completed a theology degree at Oxford University and returned to Cape Coast to be employed by the Royal African Company as a chaplain at the castle. He returned in 1766, having married Catherine Blunt the year before. Quaque was to write regular letters to his benefactors in London, and it is from these that we get a sense of what can be seen as his futile exertion on behalf of the church, his difficult relationship with the people in the town, and most importantly, his extraordinary loneliness. The book Philip Quaque's Letters to London, 1765 to 1811, was superbly edited and introduced by Adeleke Adeyeko in a scholarly edition of 2016. And before that, the life and letters of Philip Quaque had also been brought out by Vincent Carretta and Ty M. Rees in 2011. Both of these provide very useful information for understanding the life and times of Philip Quaque. Quaque was what Carretta and Rees quoting Ira Berlin, describe as an Atlantic Creole, that is to say, someone living on the periphery of the Atlantic whose complex and imbricated identities reflect the influences of Africa, Europe, and America. Carretta in Rees may have overstated the case about an American influence to Quaque's identity, except perhaps in the fact that he did have some correspondence with American-based religious figures later in his career. But the dual European-African influences are plain and self-evident, even though their true import are not so easy to work out. For his part, Adeyeko interprets the rhetorical devices Quaque deploys in the letters as suggesting two sometimes contradictory but nevertheless mutually reinforcing standpoints, those of pastor-writer and Cape Coast-bound Anglican. As Adeyeko points out, as pastor-writer, Quaque names the place of writing so as to orient his textual and worldly location towards addressees and readers for whom Africa bears a specific theological resonance. The Cape Coast-bound Anglican, on the other hand, reveals his Africanness. While he disagrees frequently with his immediate family, he counts himself as one of them. Although this person recognizes that he is neither British nor European, at least not in the ways fellow trading company officers are, his behavior manifests a thoroughgoing Anglicanism. The upshot of the two rhetorical selves that Adeyeko specifies for Quaque implies the infusion of certain theological dispositions that allow him to simultaneously claim affinity to both the Europeans and the Africans at Cape Coast, yet to distinguish himself from them with respect to their varying openness or recalcitrance toward the Christian message. Quaque's true family thus becomes that of Christianity, with various members of the African and European communities falling on a spectrum of affinity depending on their attitude toward the Christian message. Adeyeko's introduction to his volume is a fine study in close reading, invoking from the letters many historical details and also establishing the degree to which Quaque's responses to his environment reveal what Adeyeko adroitly terms the arduous pessimism of native agency. Quaque's main interlocutors during his lifetime were the various governors and trading company workers at the castle, along with the many African Cape Coasters amongst whom he sought to proselytize. Critical too to understanding Quaque was the relationship he had with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the SPG, in London, to whom he was obliged to write regular reports outlining his progress in addition to whatever he thought worthwhile of bringing to their notice. Commentators on Quaque conventionally agree that he was a failure with respect to the primary reason he was at Cape Coast, which was mainly to convert as many Africans as possible to Christianity. It is clear from Quaque's letters from as early as 1766, when he first arrived to take up his position, that he was going to have a really hard time with his epistolary interlocutors at the SPG. His letters are filled with appeals for an improvement to his salary, for more books, pamphlets, and stationery by which to carry out his work, and also for a new cassock to replace the embarrassingly threadbare one he had brought with him from England. Many times he receives no responses to his letters, and rarely to the specific claims he makes about the indifference to his Christian message coming from the several governors and trading company workers at the castle. To all these, the SPG appears to adopt an Olympian indifference, their concern being mainly with his success or otherwise in drawing more Africans into the fold. While there is ample evidence of the SPG indifference, one striking feature of the letters is that Quaque rarely cites specific biblical quotations from which to unfurl specific appeals or arguments with them. To be sure, his letters are full of biblical allusions, especially from the Gospels, but almost never does he cite a biblical quotation as a source of meditation and reflection, and to demonstrate any form of exegesis of his condition, and thus to potentially position his interlocutors as direct debaters around the Word of God. More importantly, the absence of specific biblical quotations also suggests that being embroiled in controversies with trading company officials in the castle and with unresponsive natives in the town, Quaque came to remove God as a primary trigger for reflecting upon his own unhappy conditions. The Bible becomes background but does not populate the foreground of his thoughts with exemplars to draw from. Was this perhaps a sign of creeping doubt on his part? We have no way of knowing, but as a chaplain, it is really odd that he does not make recourse to specific biblical examples to make his many arguments and appeals to the SPG. It was clear that by the time Quaque returned from London to take up his chaplaincy, that he had lost any facility he originally had with the Fanti language. This created serious problems for him, not the least of which was that he had to rely almost completely on translators for preaching to the African community at Cape Coast. Even though it is something of a surprise that after 50 years of living and working amongst them, he did not seem to have entirely mastered the language for anything other than conversational purposes. What is more startling are the views he seemed to have held about what he thought was the essentially debased character of the Fanti language. This sentiment was most pertinent to the issue of bringing up his own children. In a letter dated October 20th, 1781, addressed to the Reverend Dr. William Morris, Quaque requests permission to send his son and one of his daughters to England to be educated at his own expense. He had had these children with a local woman after the passing of his English wife. The boy was to be put in one of the foundation schools, and for the girl, Quaque expressed the hope that she be carefully and virtuously brought up under some good person or other, which, should it be effected, I need not describe to the society the consolation it will afford with thanks inexpressible. He goes on to add, in consequence thereof, I have pitched upon this method to secure their tender minds from receiving the bad impressions of the country, the vile customs and practices, and above all, the losing of their mother's vile jargon, the only obstacles of learning in these parts. Quaque was not alone in the period of local interactions with Europeans in thinking that the native tongue made indelible impressions on individual character, and that it was one of the major impediments to the Christian message. Thank you very much. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.